What would happen if an entire town was struck by the same mysterious illness, one that no doctor could explain? How would it affect the people, their daily lives, and their very sense of identity? In the 1870s, in a remote corner of Iceland, this terrifying scenario unfolded in a small, quiet village where, one by one, the villagers began to fall ill with strange and inexplicable symptoms. Feverish, exhausted, delirious, they all shared something in common, an illness that no one could understand, yet it seemed to be affecting them all in the same way. This was not the result of an infection from an outside source or a widespread contagion from a city. No, this was something far more perplexing. In this small, isolated town, nestled in the unforgiving landscape of Iceland's remote countryside, an entire community was slowly descending into a shared madness of sorts, plagued by symptoms that defied explanation. But what made this even more unsettling was that no one, not the doctors who were called in, not the townspeople themselves, could figure out what was truly happening. At first, it was easy to dismiss the early reports as mere coincidences. A few cases of fever, an occasional bout of exhaustion, maybe some dizziness or weakness. These things could happen to anyone, especially in the cold, harsh conditions of Iceland. But as the weeks passed, more and more people began to show signs of the same illness. The pattern was undeniable. It wasn't just one or two people, it was the entire town. A sickness that seemed to bond them together in a chilling way, as though they were part of a larger, unexplainable force. A sickness that, to the outside world, was a mystery. This story begins with something much more than just a medical crisis. It's about the isolation of the town itself, far removed from the medical advancements and urban centers of the time. In 1870s Iceland, most communities were self-sufficient, with limited access to modern healthcare. Travel to the outside world was often difficult and dangerous, with roads that were impassable for months during the winter. This remoteness meant that when the villagers fell ill, they had nowhere to turn for help, except for the town's own healer or the occasional doctor who made the arduous journey from a nearest city. As the illness spread through the town, panic began to set in. People grew afraid to leave their homes for fear of catching it. At first, the villagers thought it might be a form of infectious disease, something contagious that could be passed from person to person. But when it became clear that not everyone was affected in the same way and that the symptoms seemed too varied, doctors from nearby cities began to speculate that this wasn't a typical infection. Perhaps, they thought, this could be some form of mass hysteria, a psychological condition that had taken hold of the entire town. But the deeper they investigated, the more they realized that there was something far stranger at play. Every single person in the village, whether they were young or old, healthy or frail, eventually succumbed to the same mysterious set of symptoms. Some had strange rashes, others experienced bouts of delirium, and still more became plagued by chronic fatigue that seemed to have no end. The symptoms often appeared suddenly, with no warning, leaving people bedridden for days, sometimes weeks. The townspeople began to speak of it in hushed tones, referring to it as a curse or some kind of divine punishment. They looked to their local folklore, searching for answers that seemed to fit the strange affliction more than any medical explanation could. As the days dragged on, so did the uncertainty. The townspeople had long been accustomed to hard lives, but this new ordeal tested them in ways they never imagined. The fear began to seep into the very fabric of the community, and soon, it wasn't just the illness that plagued them. The social dynamics of the village began to shift. People no longer trusted each other as they once had. Rumors began to spread, with some suspecting that certain families had been cursed, while others whispered that outsiders had brought the illness into the town. The simple, everyday life they had known for so long was disintegrating before their eyes, replaced by fear and confusion. It wasn't long before medical experts were called in to investigate. But when they arrived, they found only more questions, no answers. Despite their best efforts, the doctors were baffled. They ran tests, they observed the symptoms, they even examined the town's water supply and food sources, but nothing seemed to explain what was happening. The symptoms didn't align with any known disease or ailment of the time. There were no signs of contamination, no common pathogen, no widespread environmental factor that could explain this epidemic. And yet, the symptoms persisted, sweeping through every family, every individual in the town. As one doctor put it, it was as if the town itself was sick. This medical conundrum only deepened the mystery. For many in the village, it seemed as though there was no escape from the grasp of whatever force was at work here. But it wasn't just the physical toll of the illness that made this so devastating. It was the emotional and psychological impact. The villagers were used to hardship, used to battling the harsh elements of their environment, but this was something different. This was not a problem they could simply endure or wait out. It felt as though something beyond the physical was happening to them. The illness wasn't just affecting their bodies, it was eroding their sense of self, their identity as a community. As the illness progressed, the villagers began to realize something even more troubling. They were not just sharing symptoms, they were sharing an experience. It wasn't just that they were sick together, but that they were suffering together, in a way that felt almost mystical. There was a sense of unity in the suffering, as if they had all been connected by some unseen force, all bound by the same invisible thread of illness. But that connection was not comforting. It was chilling. The town had become a place of collective torment, a living example of how fear and suffering can spread faster than any disease. In the midst of all this confusion, there was one critical question that no one could answer. What was this illness? Was it a disease that had somehow spread in a way no one could explain, or was it something else? A psychological breakdown? A mass hallucination? Or, perhaps, something even darker and more incomprehensible? No one could say for sure. The mystery grew deeper, and the villagers began to wonder if they would ever escape the grip of this shared affliction. Or, perhaps, if they were all doomed to suffer together, trapped in this strange, silent epidemic, forever. As the years passed, the town would remain in a state of uncertainty, unable to rid themselves of the illness that had taken root. Yet, in a way, the story of this town lives on, not just as a medical mystery, but as a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and body, and the ways in which fear, uncertainty, and isolation can converge to create a strange, almost surreal shared experience. And in the years to come, the question would still linger. What if something like this were to happen again? In a world that feels more connected than ever, is it possible for an entire community to share a mysterious illness, bound together by something that defies explanation? What does it take for an entire town to fall under the same strange affliction? This is the story of a town where the unknown crept in like a silent shadow, and no one knew where it would lead. The town of Skeiðarársyssla, isolated in the rugged landscape of Iceland, existed on the fringe of the world, nestled among glacier, volcanic craters, and windswept valleys. Its proximity to larger cities and medical establishments was almost non-existent, meaning the people here lived a life far removed from the advances and comforts enjoyed by more urbanized areas. The settlement was small, self-sufficient, and had endured generations of hardship. With its sparse population, life was lived slowly, governed by the cycle of the seasons and the unforgiving weather. Here, the cold, harsh winters lasted months, and in the summers, the sunlight lingered, painting the skies with endless twilight. The community, while not entirely cut off, was separated by a natural landscape so fierce that travel was difficult, even dangerous. The roads were little more than dirt paths, and during the long winter months, when snowstorms buried the countryside under thick blankets of ice, the villagers found themselves almost entirely isolated. In a place like this, the town's inhabitants were bound by more than just shared geography. Their very survival was dependent on a deep connection to the land and to each other. The Icelandic people of this region had been shaped by centuries of adversity, harsh conditions, limited resources, and the constant need to rely on one another to get through the cold, desolate winters. The town of Skeiðarársyssla, like many other remote settlements across Iceland, had been built on the foundation of resilience, community, and a keen understanding of nature's cycles. It was a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons. Spring meant the arrival of lambs and the start of planting, summer was a time of brief abundance, autumn was the time for harvesting, and winter was survival. The townspeople knew how to care for each other in ways that went beyond the ordinary, helping one another build homes, raise children, and defend against the harsh elements. But this tight-knit community was also isolated from the broader world of scientific progress and medical expertise. In the late 1800s, most people in Skeiðarársyssla had only the most basic understanding of medicine. The town's doctor, if there was one, was more of a generalist, tasked with everything from delivering babies to treating wounds to diagnosing the occasional illness. There were no hospitals or specialists nearby, no trained surgeons to turn to in times of great need. When people fell ill, the community relied on the old ways. Folk remedies, passed down through generations, were often used in an attempt to treat ailments. If someone had a fever, they might be given willow bark to ease the pain, or herbal infusions to calm the restless body. For more severe conditions, the townspeople would rely on spiritual guidance, seeking help from local healers, seers, or even clergy, who often doubled as medical advisors. Yet, Despite the fact that the people of Skidera lived with a sense of independence and self-reliance, they also carried the weight of a profound fear of the unknown. Superstition and folklore were as much a part of the fabric of their everyday lives as the weather patterns that dictated their existence. There was a belief that the land itself could be cursed, that the spirits of the mountains and glacier could come alive to wreak havoc upon those who trespassed too far into their territory. And so, the people of this isolated town lived in both harmony with nature and in fear of it. The unknown was a constant companion, and the worst affliction anyone could suffer from was not just disease, but the unexplained, a condition that defied the villagers' understanding of both the natural world and their place within it. In a world governed by these ancient beliefs, where illness was often seen as a punishment from the gods or a curse cast by spirits, it is not hard to imagine how the arrival of a mysterious sickness would have unsettled the village. But when the first cases began to appear in the early 1870s, the people of Skidera were not prepared for the strange, almost supernatural nature of what was unfolding around them. The symptoms were like nothing they had seen before, nothing they had ever experienced, and nothing they could explain away with folklore or superstition. People who had been healthy and active began to fall ill, one after another. At first, the symptoms seemed mild: fatigue, and overwhelming exhaustion that came and went without warning. But it wasn't long before things worsened. A fever began to spread like wildfire, affecting nearly everyone in the town. The fever was accompanied by rashes, dizziness, and nausea, symptoms that left many bedridden for days, weeks, even months. But what truly set this affliction apart was its persistence. Unlike typical illnesses, which might come and go, this one lingered, hanging over the town like a dark cloud that no one could escape. At first, the villagers tried to treat the illness as they had always treated sickness, by relying on the methods passed down through generations. Local healers made their rounds, administering herbal remedies and potions made from local plants, while the church prayed for divine intervention. But nothing seemed to work. The illness did not relent. In fact, it spread further. And then, a new and more disturbing pattern emerged. It wasn't just the adults who were affected. The children began to show the same symptoms, suffering from the same mysterious fever and exhaustion. As the sickness made its way through every family, the town's sense of security, of control, began to disintegrate. The bonds that had once tied the people of Skidera together started to fracture. People became afraid to be near one another, suspicious of how the illness spread and whether it could be caught from mere proximity. And so, the village began to shrink in on itself. Homes became places of quarantine, and the once bustling streets were now eerily quiet, with people looking out from their windows, afraid to venture beyond their doors. This is where the true isolation of Skidera became not just a physical reality, but a psychological one. The town, already remote, now found itself not only cut off from the rest of Iceland but from the very human connections that had held it together. In a place where everyone had once known everyone else, where help and support were just a knock away, now there was only silence and fear. The villagers, already accustomed to living in isolation from the world, found that the greatest threat they faced was no longer the unforgiving wilderness or the harsh elements, but the unseen and unfathomable illness that seemed to be consuming them. As time passed and the illness showed no signs of relenting, rumors began to spread. Some claimed that the affliction was the work of a malevolent spirit, a curse placed on the village by an ancient force that had been disturbed. Others whispered that the sickness was a form of divine punishment, a reckoning for some hidden sin that the townspeople had committed. For a community deeply embedded in its traditions and superstitions, the lack of any clear explanation was terrifying. There was no clear enemy, no tangible cause. It was as if the town itself had been struck by a force beyond understanding, beyond control, and this sense of helplessness compounded the fear that already gripped the village. With no answers from the outside world and no answers from their own doctors, the people were left to fend for themselves, both physically and psychologically. The isolation was compounded by the arrival of medical professionals from outside the town. Doctors who made the long, treacherous journey to the village were just as perplexed as the locals. Despite their formal training and access to more advanced medical resources, they too were unable to find any clear answers. Tests were conducted, blood samples taken, and local resources investigated, but nothing seemed to provide the answers that the town so desperately needed. Theories arose, ranging from the possibility of an infection carried by an animal, to some environmental cause like contaminated water or soil, to the more extreme theories of mass hysteria or even witchcraft. But no explanation seemed to satisfy the doctors, and soon, The villagers began to question whether the doctors themselves were any more capable of solving the mystery than the townspeople had been. In a place as remote as Skidera, where survival itself was an everyday struggle, the arrival of outsiders only deepened the sense of alienation. The townspeople, already isolated by their distance from the rest of Iceland, now found themselves even further apart from the broader world of medicine and science. The doctors, in their professional detachment, were seen as strangers, people who could not truly understand the ways of the land, the customs, or the people. For the villagers, their illness was not just a physical affliction. It was a cultural and psychological crisis, a breakdown of the very fabric of their community. The suffering was not just in the body, but in the mind. And it was this mental and emotional isolation, as much as the physical illness, that made this small town in Iceland so hauntingly unique in the annals of medical history. What had begun as a series of seemingly unrelated symptoms had grown into something far more sinister, an entire village, bound by an illness that defied explanation, cut off from the outside world and from the human connections that had once sustained them. And as the doctors left, the sickness remained, a silent, invisible force that continued to weave its way through the town, claiming lives, breaking spirits, and leaving a mystery in its wake that would never be fully solved. As the first cases of the strange illness began to manifest in Skidera, the villagers were initially uncertain of what to make of the symptoms. In a place like this, where life was dictated by nature's unforgiving rhythms, sickness was not an unfamiliar visitor. Fevers, colds, and the occasional bout of flu were common occurrences, and they were usually something that could be managed with rest, local herbs, or the help of the village healer. The community had grown accustomed to these familiar cycles of health and illness, each season bringing its own set of challenges and remedies. However, this illness was different. The symptoms were unlike anything they had experienced before, and the pace at which it spread was terrifying. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A man in his mid-40s, Jonas, began to feel unusually tired, a weariness that he couldn't shake off despite a full night's rest. He thought little of it at first. Perhaps the weather was simply getting to him, or maybe he had overexerted himself while working the fields. But as the days passed, the fatigue intensified. He found it difficult to rise in the mornings, and when he did, his limbs felt heavy and uncooperative, as if he were moving through water. Then came the fever. It started as a low-grade temperature, but it quickly escalated, causing him to break out in sweats one moment and shiver uncontrollably the next. His once steady hands trembled, making the simplest of tasks nearly impossible. For days, he couldn't get out of bed, and when he did manage to sit up, dizziness took hold of him, forcing him back down again. His family thought it was just the flu, perhaps even a bad cold, but when he began to develop strange rashes, dark, blotchy patches across his arms and legs, they grew concerned. Jonas, normally a man of strong constitution, could not explain what was happening to his body. Soon, more villagers began to experience the same unsettling symptoms. It wasn't long before the fever spread beyond Jonas, striking his wife, then his children. The sickness quickly became something that couldn't be explained away by the typical remedies of the village. People who had been strong and healthy were suddenly bedridden, and not with just any common illness, but with something that appeared to share the same symptoms: fever, extreme fatigue, skin rashes, dizziness, and an overall sense of helplessness. It was as though the disease had a mind of its own, picking out people at random, and yet, each case seemed eerily similar to the next. At first, the people of Skidera thought it might be a simple contagion. Perhaps someone had brought a sickness into the village, some foreign illness that had spread through their close-knit community. But there were no outsiders arriving, no travelers from distant lands to explain the sudden onset of sickness. The villagers had been living their secluded lives in the same way they always had, without interaction with the outside world. The town's isolation made it unlikely that the disease had originated from elsewhere, and yet it spread like wildfire among them. It was as though something had settled over the land itself, a curse that had chosen them for reasons no one could understand. As the weeks passed, more and more people fell ill, and the community began to panic. Local healers, who had previously been trusted to deal with minor ailments, found themselves helpless in the face of this mysterious affliction. The remedies that had worked for generations, herbal tinctures, poultices, and prayers, did little to alleviate the symptoms. In fact, in some cases, the sickness seemed to worsen with each passing day. The rashes grew more pronounced, the fever became more intense, and the dizziness left people unable to perform even the most basic tasks. Some villagers began to hallucinate, their minds clouded by the fever, and others became so weak that they could no longer stand on their own. The once lively town had fallen into a somber silence, with people confined to their homes, too sick to interact, too fearful to step outside. The townspeople's anxiety deepened as the illness appeared to defy all understanding. It was not a typical infection that could be cured with herbs or rest. It was as if the sickness was playing by its own set of rules, with symptoms that did not match anything in the doctor's medical textbooks. Some villagers even speculated that this illness was something far more sinister than a mere disease. Could it be a curse? A punishment from the gods? Was this a divine retribution for some sin committed by the town, or perhaps a manifestation of some dark force they had unknowingly disturbed? Skidera had always been steeped in folklore, with many villagers still holding on to ancient beliefs about spirits, nature's wrath, and the supernatural forces that govern their world. In times of uncertainty, the line between the natural and the supernatural often blurred, and the idea that a curse could be at the heart of this affliction was not an entirely unfounded one. In this small, isolated community, people looked for patterns in the illness that might provide some clue as to its origins. They began to notice that certain families seemed to be affected more severely than others. The symptoms spread rapidly within specific households, and soon entire families were bedridden, while other families, though not untouched, seemed to experience the illness in a less severe form. The concept of family curses came into play, and some villagers began to believe that certain bloodlines were more susceptible to the illness than others. It wasn't just that the illness seemed to take hold of specific people, but that it appeared to affect them in a particular order. Grandparents, parents, children, all struck by the same symptoms, one after the other. In some families, the illness was so severe that it led to death, which further fueled the idea that this was not just a disease, but a calamity with a purpose. As more people fell ill, the question of what to do became more pressing. The town's isolation had always been a source of pride, a shield against the outside world, but now it felt like a prison. The villagers were trapped, both physically and mentally, within the walls of their homes, their only connection to the outside world the distant, unyielding mountains that loomed over the settlement. Even the few doctors who ventured into the town were baffled, unable to offer any clear answers. Medical science in the late 1800s was still in its infancy, and the town had no access to the advanced techniques or technologies that might have shed light on the illness. The doctors were limited to observation, their knowledge grounded in an era when diseases were still understood in simplistic terms. Could it be some form of contagion? A disease carried by animals or insects? Was it some new, as yet unidentified virus or bacteria? Or was this a case of mass hysteria, a psychological condition that was spreading among the community like wildfire? One theory that began to take hold was that this might be a form of mass psychogenic illness, a psychological condition in which the symptoms of an illness spread from person to person within a close-knit group, fueled by fear and anxiety. The symptoms seemed too similar to be explained by chance, and some believed that the shared fear of the unknown had created a situation where the body began to manifest physical symptoms in response to collective stress. In the absence of a clear medical explanation, this theory gained traction, and the villagers, already on edge, began to doubt whether they were suffering from a disease at all. Were they truly sick, or were they simply succumbing to the power of suggestion? But despite these theories, there was still no denying the severity of the illness. The sickened villagers did not improve with time. The fever persisted, the weakness endured, and the rashes spread. Children were no longer playing in the streets. The elderly, once active and independent, now languished in their homes, unable to even sit up. The hospital in the nearest city was a long journey away, and with winter in full force, it would have been impossible to reach it. The few brave doctors who ventured into the town could offer little more than sympathy, their baffled faces reflecting the same confusion that had taken hold of the villagers. The sense of isolation, both physical and emotional, intensified. The townspeople had long relied on each other for support, but now, the very act of reaching out to a neighbor seemed fraught with danger. Could they catch the illness by simply being too close? The walls between families grew taller, as people withdrew into their homes, fearful of both the disease and the uncertainty of their situation. The sickness had woven its way into the fabric of their lives, and as the weeks turned into months, it seemed as though there was no end in sight. Some began to lose hope, questioning whether they would ever return to the life they once knew. The once vibrant community was now a place of quiet suffering, its streets empty, its homes filled with the sounds of those too sick to leave. Through all of this, one thing became increasingly clear. The illness was not just a physical affliction, it was a collective experience, one that transcended the boundaries of family, class, and age. Every person in Skydarasisla was touched by it, in one way or another, and the more the illness spread, the more the town began to feel like a single organism, suffering as one. The sickness was not just a set of symptoms. It had become the defining feature of life in Skydarasisla. And for the villagers, there was no escape. It had become their world. As the sickness that plagued Skydarasisla deepened and spread, it was no longer something that could be dismissed or treated with the common remedies that the village had relied on for generations. What started as a strange illness affecting a few individuals had become an all-consuming force, gripping the entire town in its relentless grasp. People, both young and old, had fallen ill with the same baffling symptoms: fatigue, fever, rashes, dizziness, and, for some, a strange delirium that they couldn't shake. Yet, despite the increasing severity of the illness, no one, neither the villagers nor the medical experts that were called in for help, could explain what was happening. And so, the search for answers intensified, as doctors, healers, and scientists began to examine the situation from every possible angle. The first medical experts to arrive in the town were local physicians who had been alerted to the situation by worried townspeople. They came in with the assumption that this might simply be a flu outbreak or some sort of common infection, something that could be handled with basic medical care, perhaps with some prescribed rest and herbal remedies. However, as soon as they began examining the affected individuals, they quickly realized that this was no ordinary sickness. The fever was unlike any typical fever they had seen. It was not a simple fluctuation in body temperature but a persistent high fever that waxed and waned unpredictably. The skin rashes appeared to be spreading in strange patterns, not resembling any known illness. There was no visible infection or common ailment that could account for the swelling, redness, or the severity of the symptoms. Even more perplexing was the dizziness and fatigue. The villagers reported feeling an overwhelming sense of weakness that didn't seem to improve with rest. Some couldn't even sit up without feeling like they would collapse. The doctors attempted various treatments, administering herbs to bring down the fever, using poultices to treat the rashes, and advising bed rest. Yet, none of these common remedies seemed to have any effect. The sick remained bedridden, their bodies sluggish, their minds clouded. In some cases, the illness became even more pronounced. People began experiencing hallucinations, murmuring incoherently in their sleep or speaking in a way that was uncharacteristic for them. Children, once lively and playful, grew subdued, staring vacantly or crying out for no apparent reason. Despite their best efforts, the doctors were forced to admit that they were in the dark. None of the usual medical treatments, even those based on tried-and-true practices, offered any relief. It wasn't just that the doctors were unable to cure the illness, it was that they couldn't even begin to diagnose it. They examined the village's food and water supply, ruling out the possibility of contamination. They checked the environment for toxins, considered whether some local plant might have triggered an allergic reaction, or whether the sickness could have come from some kind of exposure to a contaminated animal. But nothing fit. There were no clear indicators that pointed to a single cause. The isolation of Skydarasisla, coupled with the strange nature of the sickness, made it all the more difficult for the doctors to come to any concrete conclusions. It was as though the town had been struck by some kind of invisible force, one that didn't obey the rules of nature or medicine. With no clear explanation at hand, the doctors turned to other possibilities. Perhaps this was not a physical illness at all but something psychological, a form of mass hysteria. Mass psychogenic illness, often referred to as mass hysteria, was a known phenomenon in which groups of people would develop similar symptoms without any identifiable physical cause. The symptoms, however, could be very real: headaches, nausea, dizziness, and even fainting. The power of suggestion, combined with a collective belief in a shared affliction, could cause a number of people to fall victim to similar ailments. Given the extreme isolation of the town and the pervasive fear that was starting to take root among the villagers, this theory seemed plausible to the doctors. The village was enduring an unprecedented event, an illness with no name, no cause, and no cure. Could the sickness have spread not through bacteria or virus, but through the minds of the villagers themselves? The psychological explanation suggested that the fear of the illness had itself created the symptoms. As the villagers became more and more convinced that they were sick, their collective anxiety could have triggered the physical manifestations of illness. They had no clear understanding of what was happening, and as a result, their minds may have been responding to the fear by producing symptoms that mirrored an actual disease. This could explain the initial spread of the illness, as the power of suggestion worked its way through the town. However, there was one major issue with this theory. While mass hysteria could certainly explain some of the symptoms, it didn't account for the severity of the illness. The rashes, the prolonged fever, the dizziness, the hallucinations, these were not things that could be explained away by simply saying that the mind was playing tricks on the body. In an effort to investigate this possibility further, the doctors began asking questions about the villagers' emotional states. What were they afraid of? Was there a common thread of anxiety running through the population that could explain the widespread hysteria? But as they spoke to the people, they were met with conflicting responses. Some villagers were deeply afraid, convinced that some curse had descended upon them, while others remained stoic, determined to carry on. There were whispers about divine punishment, about spirits taking revenge for some perceived wrong, but no one could pinpoint exactly what the wrong might have been. The idea of mass hysteria was quickly losing traction among the medical experts. The symptoms were simply too physical, too tangible to be dismissed as mere imagination. As one doctor put it, "These people are suffering. There is something real happening here, but we cannot understand it." As the doctors struggled to make sense of the situation, more medical experts were called in, each one bringing their own theories and approaches. They arrived from other parts of Iceland and from nearby countries, traveling to Skeiðarársyssla with the hope of finding answers. But none could provide a definitive explanation. One expert, an experienced physician from Reykjavik, proposed that the town had been exposed to a previously unknown pathogen, something that had evolved in the isolated environment of Skeiðarársyssla and was now affecting the population. But there was no way to confirm this. No test could identify the agent, no microscope could reveal its presence. Other experts suggested that the town was suffering from some kind of collective trauma, an event that had triggered a mass psychological breakdown, one that manifested as physical illness. But again, this theory seemed inadequate in explaining the full extent of the symptoms. While the doctors were stumped, the villagers themselves began to look for answers in their own way. With the rise of fear came an increase in superstition. Folk remedies were revisited, old rituals were revived, and the villagers turned to their traditions and folklore in an attempt to understand the nature of the sickness. Local healers, many of whom had been practicing for years, began performing ceremonies to rid the town of the illness. Prayers were said, rituals were conducted, and offerings were made to appease the spirits. Some villagers believed that the sickness was a punishment from the gods, and they began offering sacrifices in hopes of earning their forgiveness. The doctors may have been perplexed, but the villagers were not without their own answers, even if those answers were rooted in the mystical and the supernatural. As the sickness continued to ravage the town, the search for answers seemed to reach an impasse. The doctors had nothing more to offer, and the villagers had become increasingly divided between those who put their faith in medical science and those who turned to ancient beliefs. The fear of the unknown, coupled with the inability to cure or even diagnose the illness, left everyone feeling trapped in a nightmarish situation. It was as if the town had become a living example of just how little anyone understood about the complexities of disease, both physical and psychological. Skeiðarársyssla was now a place where reality and superstition intertwined, where sickness couldn't be explained by medicine alone, and where the answers were as elusive as the disease itself. The only certainty left was the suffering, and the growing realization that the town would never be the same again. The arrival of the doctors from the outside world had initially raised the villagers' hopes, offering a glimmer of possibility that the mysterious illness that gripped Skeiðarársyssla might be understood and, perhaps, cured. But as time wore on, the doctors' inability to provide answers only deepened the sense of despair that hung like a fog over the town. Each physician who came seemed to bring with them only more confusion, more uncertainty. There were no easy explanations, no quick fixes. The more the medical professionals investigated, the more the illness seemed to defy categorization, leaving the townspeople to wonder if they were, in fact, witnessing something beyond human comprehension. Despite the failures of modern medicine to provide clarity, there was a creeping realization among the doctors that what they were witnessing in Skeiðarársyssla might be something far more complex than a mere disease. With each passing day, the town seemed less like a place of traditional illness and more like a laboratory for a grand, unsettling experiment that no one had signed up for. The symptoms of the illness seemed to defy any known biological or medical condition, suggesting that there might be some deeper, unknown factor at play, an external force, perhaps, that none of them could see or measure. The villagers were suffering physically, but the fear that had taken hold of them was just as debilitating as the sickness itself. It was as if the illness had wrapped itself around the town, slowly, insidiously, until it had taken root in both body and mind. The feeling of isolation in Skeiðarársyssla was more pronounced now than ever. The villagers had always been accustomed to a certain degree of separation from the outside world, but this sickness made their isolation feel even more acute. With the roads impassable due to heavy snow and ice, and the town's location far from the nearest cities, the idea of receiving help from the larger world seemed almost impossible. The villagers were cut off from any form of support, and as the sickness spread, they began to question their own strength to endure. They were on their own, in a world that seemed to have abandoned them. The arrival of outsiders, doctors, medical experts, and even researchers who were drawn by the mystery, only served to highlight how truly alone Skydarasisla was. The villagers had long been accustomed to living with a sense of independence, but now that independence felt like a prison. The village had always been a close-knit community, with everyone knowing everyone else, their lives intertwined by necessity. But the illness had transformed that closeness into something more suffocating. What had once been a place of support and shared experience was now a town divided by fear and uncertainty. No one trusted anyone else completely, as rumors and suspicions began to spread about how the disease was transmitted and what might be causing it. The very thing that had once bound the community together, the shared understanding of their lives and their dependence on one another, was now the thing that made them fearful. People began to shut themselves off, retreating into their homes, afraid that even the slightest contact could lead to their own infection. The collective suffering of the village was mirrored by the individual torment of those who were most severely affected. Jonas, the man who had been one of the first to show symptoms, had once been a pillar of the community. Strong, dependable, and deeply embedded in the daily life of the town, he had always been the one to lend a hand when needed, the one to offer advice or comfort in times of trouble. But now, bedridden and unable to care for himself, Jonas was a mere shadow of his former self. His family, who had always looked up to him, were now forced to watch him deteriorate, powerless to help. His wife, Elisabeth, who had spent years tending to the needs of their children and their home, now found herself caring for her husband, a role reversal that only added to the weight of the illness that was slowly consuming them both. Every day, she watched as Jonas struggled to breathe, his chest heaving as the fever ravaged his body. His once strong and capable hands, the hands that had built their home, now trembled uncontrollably. His once clear eyes were now clouded with delirium, and his mind, once sharp, was now clouded by fevered hallucinations. Their children, too, had not been spared. The illness had spread to them in waves, first the youngest, then the older ones. Elisabeth did her best to care for them all, but as each new member of the family fell ill, she found herself stretched thin, both physically and emotionally. The once thriving household had become a place of constant suffering, with every room filled with the sounds of coughing, the rattling of breath, the whimpering of children in pain. The family had been brought low, not just by the sickness, but by the realization that they were helpless in the face of it. There was no doctor to turn to, no cure on the horizon, and no one who could offer them any guidance. The isolation that had once been comforting now felt like a death sentence, a cruel reminder that they were cut off from the world at the very moment they needed help the most. It was not just the physical toll of the illness that weighed on the people of Skydarasisla, it was the psychological strain. In a town where every face was familiar, where the rhythms of life had long been predictable, the sudden onset of this unrelenting affliction brought with it a sense of chaos and confusion. As people grew sicker, they also grew more desperate. Fear became the currency of the town, traded between neighbors and family members as they searched for some semblance of hope. But hope was in short supply. Every effort to find a cure or even an explanation only seemed to lead to more dead ends. The question of why this was happening to Skydarasisla gnawed at the hearts and minds of the villagers. They were not just afraid of the sickness, they were afraid of the unknown. What had brought this illness to their doorsteps? Why were they being punished? What had they done to deserve this fate? In a town where superstition and folklore held as much weight as science, many began to turn inward, searching their own hearts and minds for the answer. Some believed that they had angered the gods, that their isolation had led them to offend the spirits of the land. Others believed that the town was cursed, perhaps by an ancient wrong, a transgression from the past that had been forgotten by most, but that had now come to claim its toll. The illness became more than just a disease. It became a symbol of their own guilt, their own failure to live in harmony with the forces of nature. The illness that had begun as a physical affliction soon took on an almost spiritual significance. It was no longer just about the pain in the body, the rashes on the skin, or the fever that caused the mind to slip into delirium. It was about the fear that had taken root in the hearts of the people, a fear that had spread faster than the illness itself. It was a fear that could not be treated with medicine, a fear that could not be soothed with the comfort of a familiar face. This fear, this growing sense of helplessness, was the real sickness that had infected Skydarasisla. And yet, despite all of this suffering, the community did not give up. There was still a glimmer of defiance that burned in the hearts of some. The older generations, who had lived through hardships far greater than the one they were facing now, rallied together, determined not to let fear defeat them. They turned to the land that had sustained them for generations, to the rituals and traditions that had been passed down through the ages. They believed that if they could call on the strength of the land, they could find a way to survive this curse. It was in their hands to protect their future, even if they had no clear answers to the questions that haunted them. Slowly, the townspeople began to band together again. The village healer, whose methods had been dismissed by the medical experts, became a central figure in the community once more. She wasn't able to cure the illness, but her presence, her faith in the traditions that had kept the town alive for so many years, offered a sense of comfort. People began to gather in her home, seeking solace in the rituals that had once provided them with a sense of safety. While the doctors from outside continued to search for answers, the villagers themselves began to focus on what they could control, how they treated one another, how they comforted those who were suffering, how they held onto their community. The sickness that had once felt like an impenetrable wall began to feel like something more malleable, something that could, at the very least, be endured. And though the doctors may have been unable to offer a cure, and the fear continued to loom over the town, the people of Skydarasisla found a new kind of resilience in their shared suffering. They were no longer waiting for the outside world to save them. They had learned that they would have to save themselves. Together. As the illness continued to ravage Skydarasisla, the isolation that had once been a familiar part of the town's character became a source of suffocating despair. The villagers, who had long lived in harmony with the harsh landscape of Iceland, found themselves facing an enemy they could not see, touch, or understand. What had begun as a seemingly innocent illness, a fever here, a rash there, had transformed into something far more sinister. As time passed, the sickness spread through every household, claiming lives, breaking spirits, and eroding the very fabric of the town. The arrival of outsiders, medical experts, and researchers did little to alleviate the villagers' suffering. The doctors who arrived, brimming with hope and determination, had little more to offer than their formal training. They brought with them all the knowledge of the outside world, all the advancements of science, but they were ill-equipped to tackle a mystery that defied all conventional understanding. The villagers, already steeped in superstition and folklore, began to wonder if there was a deeper, more insidious force at work, a force that no doctor, no healer, no researcher could unravel. As the weeks turned into months, the doctors and the people of Skydarasisla were no closer to understanding the cause of the illness. The rashes continued to spread, the fevers grew more intense, and the dizziness became a constant affliction for many. Yet, despite the endless search for an answer, nothing concrete was discovered. No one had any idea what this disease truly was, nor why it was claiming the lives of so many. With each passing day, hope seemed to fade just a little more. In a village where every person knew each other's name, where relationships were built on trust and interdependence, the sickness became a shared experience that bound everyone together, though not in the way anyone would have wanted. Skydarasisla was no longer a village filled with the sounds of children playing, the laughter of families, or the hum of daily life. The streets were eerily quiet, the windows darkened, and the air was thick with the weight of fear. Families withdrew into their homes, leaving the once bustling town centre abandoned. No one dared to venture out without a sense of dread, for fear of becoming the next to succumb to the illness that had gripped them all. The once vibrant community had become a shadow of itself, its people separated not only by physical distance but by the psychological weight of the sickness that loomed over them. For some, the fear of the illness itself became almost as debilitating as the disease. The townspeople no longer trusted their bodies. They no longer trusted their neighbors. Rumors began to spread, fueled by the uncertainty and the growing paranoia that infected the town. Some believed that the illness was not natural, that it had been brought on by some external force. There were whispers of witches, curses, and supernatural forces at play. The tight-knit community that had once supported one another was now divided, with old suspicions and fears rising to the surface. No one could be trusted completely, for who knew where the disease had come from, and who might be harboring it without knowing? Those who had once helped their neighbors with everything from building homes to raising children now found themselves unable to even share a meal with one another. The isolation had taken on a new form, one that was not just physical but emotional, psychological, and spiritual. As the sickness continued to spread, the once familiar faces of Skidera began to change. The tall, proud figures who had once greeted each other in the town square now shuffled through the streets, their eyes sunken and their faces gaunt from fever and exhaustion. The strong and steady hands that had once worked the land were now too weak to even hold a cup of water. The children, who had once run through the streets in joyous abandon, now sat in silence, their small faces drawn and pale, their eyes vacant and distant. It was as though the very essence of the town had been sucked away by the sickness, leaving only the shell of a community that was slowly withering away. The doctors who had come from the outside world were equally bewildered by what they found. The traditional methods of diagnosis and treatment, honed over centuries of medical practice, had proven ineffective. The fever that had stricken the villagers seemed unlike any other. It didn't break as fevers typically did, nor did it respond to the usual methods of treatment. The rashes that accompanied the illness were not consistent with any known skin condition. The dizziness that left so many bedridden was not a simple symptom of fatigue. It was a debilitating condition that left people unable to move or even stand. What had started as a simple case of illness had now transformed into something far more complex, something that the doctors could not even begin to diagnose. Despite their expertise, the physicians were no closer to an explanation than the villagers themselves. It was as if the illness had no rules, no boundaries, something that eluded every attempt to understand it. In the face of these failures, the villagers turned to their own methods of coping. The traditional remedies that had been passed down through generations of Icelandic families were called upon once more. Herbal infusions, poultices made from the local plants, and spiritual prayers became the focus of the villagers' daily lives. In a community that had relied so heavily on the land, these traditional methods were not just a source of comfort. They were a way of reclaiming some control over a situation that had otherwise rendered them helpless. The rituals and practices that had long been a part of their lives, steeped in the ancient ways of their ancestors, were now their last hope. They looked to the land for answers, seeking solace in the rituals that had once brought them peace. Some turned to the church, seeking divine intervention for what seemed like an act of God. The priest, an older man who had seen many trials in his time, began holding daily services, hoping that prayer and faith could somehow reverse the course of the illness. The community gathered together, their voices joined in him, though many did so with a quiet desperation in their hearts. It was a desperate form of hope, an attempt to reconcile the suffering that had taken root in their lives. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the illness continued its relentless course. No amount of prayer, no amount of herbal remedies, seemed to have any effect. People continued to grow weaker. More people died. It seemed as though the sickness was not just a physical affliction. It was a judgment, a trial of faith that no one could endure forever. As the toll of the illness mounted, the doctors who had come to help began to leave, their optimism shattered by their own lack of answers. They had come to Skidera in the hopes of solving a mystery, but instead, they had found themselves caught in a puzzle with no solution. They had no explanation for the illness, no diagnosis, no cure. The disease, if it could even be called that, had no pattern, no logic to it. It could not be explained by science, by medicine, or by reason. All the doctors could do was observe, record, and hope that someone, somewhere, would come up with a solution. But as the doctors left, the villagers were left to cope with the fallout. The isolation, both physical and emotional, grew more intense. With no experts to rely on, the townspeople were forced to confront the sickness on their own terms. The illness, once a distant threat, had now become their reality. There was no escaping it. There were no answers to be found, no salvation on the horizon. And so, the town began to change in ways that no one had anticipated. The once tight-knit, communal life had become one of survival, where every day was a struggle, and every person was on their own journey to either recover or succumb. The fear that had pervaded the town from the start continued to rise. Some villagers started to question whether the sickness was the result of something more sinister, something that could not be defeated by medicine alone. Was it a curse, or was it something even more terrible, a message from the gods or from some otherworldly force that could not be seen or understood? There were no clear answers, only more questions. The town that had once been a beacon of strength and resilience was now a place of uncertainty and dread, where the lines between the natural and supernatural were blurred beyond recognition. In the face of this fear, the villagers found themselves retreating further into themselves, unable to trust anyone but their own families. The bonds of community that had once been the lifeblood of Skidera had now become a source of suspicion. Neighbors turned away from one another, unwilling to risk becoming infected. The once bustling village was now a ghost town, its streets empty, its homes filled with sickness and suffering. The town had become a place where survival was not just a matter of health, it was a matter of the soul. The villagers had been tested, and they were beginning to wonder if they would survive at all. As time dragged on in Skydarasisla, the sense of hopelessness began to deepen. The villagers, who had once prided themselves on their resilience, were now beginning to lose the will to fight. The illness that had arrived so mysteriously, so suddenly, showed no signs of abating. People continued to fall ill, entire families remained bedridden, and the death toll began to rise. The doctors who had come in search of answers had left, frustrated by their inability to diagnose or treat the sickness. The isolation of the village, once a defining feature of life in Skydarasisla, now felt like a curse. Cut off from the outside world, the townspeople were left to navigate this nightmare alone, with only each other for support, and even that support was fraying as fear and desperation set in. As the illness spread and more people succumbed to its effects, the village's sense of community began to disintegrate. The once close bonds between families and neighbors, forged over generations of shared experience, were now being tested in ways no one could have foreseen. No one dared to get too close to anyone else for fear of becoming infected, and even the most basic acts of kindness, offering a drink of water, helping with a simple task, were becoming increasingly fraught with suspicion. It was as though the very air they breathed had become dangerous, and every interaction, no matter how innocent, carried the potential for contamination. The village that had once been a place of warmth and shared purpose had become a place of quiet, fearful isolation. But it wasn't just the fear of the illness itself that tore at the fabric of the community. It was the uncertainty that surrounded the sickness, the complete lack of understanding about what was happening to them. With no answers from the doctors, no knowledge of how the disease was spreading or why it was affecting some people more severely than others, the villagers began to seek answers in the only place they knew, their past. Iceland, like many isolated cultures, was steeped in a rich history of folklore and myth, and it wasn't long before these ancient stories began to take on new meaning in the face of the illness. Superstition began to run rampant, and the lines between reality and fantasy blurred. At the heart of this growing unease was the belief that the illness might be a punishment, a curse from the gods or some otherworldly force. Skydarasisla had long been a place steeped in tales of spirits and supernatural occurrences, and the villagers, many of whom had lived in isolation for most of their lives, often looked to these old stories for meaning and comfort in times of crisis. The stories they told around the fire, the legends they passed down from generation to generation, suddenly felt all too real. There were whispers in the streets that perhaps the village had angered a spirit, a creature from the ancient tales, or had committed some grave sin that had led to divine retribution. The idea that the sickness might be a curse, some dark force sent to punish them for an unknown wrongdoing, gained traction among the villagers. It was easier to believe in something tangible, something that could be explained by the myths that had always guided them, than to accept that the illness was simply an insurmountable mystery that defied all logic and reason. As this fear and superstition spread, some of the villagers turned to the old ways, seeking out the village healer, an elderly woman named Freydis, who had long been regarded as a keeper of ancient knowledge. Freydis was a relic of another time, a woman who had spent her entire life in Skydarasisla, tending to the sick, performing rituals, and offering advice to those in need. She was a master of herbal remedies, known for her knowledge of plants that could heal the body and the mind. But her true power, at least in the eyes of many, lay in her connection to the spiritual world. Freydis had always been regarded with a mix of reverence and fear by the villagers. Her deep understanding of the old ways and her ability to speak of spirits and omens made her an enigmatic figure, someone whose words carried weight but also stirred unease. Now, in the face of the crisis, Freydis became the focal point for the villagers' desperate search for answers. People came to her for guidance, seeking protection from the illness, hoping that her ancient knowledge would offer a way to reverse the curse that they believed had befallen them. They sought her out for rituals and blessings, asking for her help in appeasing the spirits or the gods they believed were responsible for the sickness. Freydis, for her part, did not deny them. She performed her rituals, muttering ancient prayers, lighting candles, and using herbs and incantations that had been passed down to her through the generations. She did not claim to have the answers, but she offered what she could, a sense of control, a belief that if they followed the old ways, they might stand a chance against the illness that had overwhelmed their town. In her small, dimly lit cottage at the edge of the village, Freydis conducted ceremonies that seemed to bring a sense of peace to some, though it was a fragile peace, built on the hope that something beyond their comprehension could save them. She instructed the villagers to burn certain herbs, to say specific prayers, to make offerings to the spirits of the land. It was a desperate act, a last resort in a time when nothing else seemed to work. Some of the villagers believed that Freydis's rituals were the only thing that kept the illness from claiming even more lives. Others were skeptical, viewing her practices as little more than superstition, but in their fear, they too sought her out, unable to completely disregard the possibility that there was truth in her words. The church, too, became a place of solace for many. The priest, a man who had seen his fair share of hardship in his years as a servant of God, began to hold regular masses, praying for the souls of the sick and for the protection of the town. He reminded the villagers that faith in God, no matter how difficult the circumstances, would see them through this trial. But even the priest's assurances felt hollow at times. How could the villagers maintain their faith in God when it seemed as though they had been abandoned by divine mercy? How could they continue to pray when every day brought more suffering, more sickness, and more death? As the town's spiritual leaders, Freydis and the priest, took on increasingly important roles, the villagers began to divide. There were those who held fast to the old ways, who believed that only the ancient knowledge of their ancestors would save them. These villagers turned to Freydis, placing their trust in the rituals and charms she provided. Then there were those who turned to the priest and his church, holding on to their faith that God would deliver them from this calamity. These divisions deepened as the illness continued its unrelenting spread. Families were torn apart by the differing beliefs, with some members seeking spiritual intervention and others dismissing it as mere superstition. The tension in the town grew palpable as the villagers found themselves at odds, not just with the disease, but with each other.